Something unusual is happening in families across the country right now and around the world, and parents are noticing it everywhere. A young adult gets a job and quits after the third shift because the manager corrected them. A teenager starts a class, realizes it requires more effort than expected, and drops it halfway through the semester. A young adult living at home says they want independence, but when independence requires responsibility, bills, schedules, and accountability, they retreat back into avoidance. Parents often describe this pattern with confusion and frustration. They say things like, "When I was that age, quitting wasn't even an option." Or, "Why does everything feel overwhelming for them?" What many families are experiencing right now is something psychologists increasingly recognize as a low tolerance for friction. Friction is the resistance we encounter when we pursue something meaningful. It is the moment when effort replaces ease. It is the uncomfortable middle space between starting something and becoming competent at it. And here is the important truth. Friction is not a problem. Friction is actually the training ground where confidence, resilience, and competence are built. Welcome back to the Path to Peace Therapy podcast. If you're new here, my name is Stephanie Buckley. I am a solution-focused therapist, parenting strategist, and family systems coach who specializes in ADHD, OCD executive functioning challenges, emotional regulation, and the complex dynamics that unfold within families when someone is struggling with motivation, follow-through, or regulation. Solution-focused therapy is an approach within psychology that focuses on building practical strategies and forward movement rather than staying stuck analyzing problems indefinitely. Instead of asking only, "Why is this happening?" Solution-focused work also asks, "What small shifts can we make today that move the family system towards stability and progress?" It emphasizes identifying strengths, recognizing patterns, and creating actionable steps that help families regain momentum. Another framework that deeply informs my work is Bowen Family Systems Theory. Bowen Family Systems Theory, developed by psychiatrist Murray Bowen, is one of the foundational models in family psychology. It proposes that individual behavior cannot be fully understood in isolation because every person is part of an interconnected emotional system. In other words, when one person in a family changes, the entire family system shifts. For example, if a young adult struggles with motivation or responsibility, the issue is rarely just about that individual. Often the family system has slowly adapted around that struggle. One parent may become the enforcer, another may become the protector, and the young adult may unconsciously occupy the role of the overwhelmed or dependent member of the system. Bowen theory helps us understand how these roles develop and how families can shift them in healthier directions. I'm also a mother to a thriving neurodivergent 23-year-old son with ADHD, who is an incredible musician, singer, songwriter, and multi-instrumentalist. Supporting him required patience, structure, and a deep understanding of how neurodivergent brains develop over time. I've been married for over 3 decades, and both my personal life and professional work shape the insights I share here. I created this podcast because when my son was younger, I didn't fully understand what was happening neurologically in his brain, and I know many parents listening today are asking the same question. Why does everything feel so hard for my child? My goal is to translate behavior into brain science, psychology, and family systems insight so parents can move from frustration to strategy and from chaos to structure. And today, we are beginning a new series exploring something that is affecting many families right now. What is psychological friction? In psychology, friction refers to any obstacle, delay, or discomfort that arises when a person attempts to accomplish a goal. Friction is the moment when something stops being easy. It can appear in many forms. Friction might look like boredom while studying for a test. It might look like repeating a guitar chord 100 times before your fingers finally learn the pattern. It might look like receiving constructive criticism from a supervisor at work. For parents, friction often shows up in everyday household moments. A teenager may begin homework, encounter a challenging math problem, and immediately say the assignment is pointless. A young adult may start a job where they are required to sweep floors, stock shelves, or perform repetitive tasks, and after 2 weeks they conclude the job is beneath them. In these moments, the friction is not the math problem or the sweeping itself. The friction is the emotional discomfort of being in the learning phase rather than the mastery phase. And psychologically speaking, that learning phase is exactly where growth occurs. The brain structure responsible for persistence is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the area of the brain located behind the forehead and is often described as the brain's executive center. It governs what psychologists call executive functioning skills, which include planning, impulse control, decision-making, emotional regulation, and the ability to continue working toward a goal even when the process becomes uncomfortable. One crucial fact many parents are unaware of is that the prefrontal cortex does not fully mature until roughly age 25. And with children who are neurodivergent, this means they are a few more years behind the neurotypical brain. This means teenagers and young adults are still developing the neurological circuitry that allows them to tolerate frustration and delay gratification. And here is where friction plays a critical role. The brain strengthens neural pathways through a process known as neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to change and adapt based on repeated experiences. When a young person repeatedly works through challenges, difficult homework assignments, demanding coaches, long work shifts, the brain gradually builds stronger pathways for persistence. However, if friction is consistently avoided, those pathways do not develop as strongly. The brain learns a different lesson. It learns that discomfort should be escaped rather than navigated. Another critical factor in this conversation is dopamine regulation. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter involved in motivation, reward anticipation, and learning. While many people refer to dopamine as the brain's pleasure chemical, neuroscientists more accurately describe it as a motivation signal. Dopamine increases when the brain anticipates a reward, which encourages the person to continue pursuing that reward. In a healthy environment, dopamine follows a natural cycle. Effort leads to progress leads to reward, and reward leads to satisfaction. However, modern technology has dramatically altered this cycle. Many digital platforms, social media, video games, streaming services deliver rapid dopamine spikes without requiring effort. For example, a teenager can scroll through short videos for an hour and receive hundreds of small bursts of novelty and stimulation. A video game may provide constant feedback through points, rewards, and achievements. When the brain becomes accustomed to this level of stimulation, slower real-world activities begin to feel intolerable. Studying feels boring. Entry-level jobs feel tedious. Learning new skills feels frustrating, not because those activities changed, but because the brain's reward expectations changed. To move from theory to action, we have to create a micro-friction contract. In a Bowenian system, this isn't a list of demands. It is a clear, low reactivity agreement that defines where the parent's responsibility ends and the young adult's agency begins. The goal is to create a predictable friction that allows the young adult's nervous system to prepare for the discomfort rather than being blindsided by it. By documenting these expectations, you reduce the emotional noise and triangulation that occurs when parents have to nag or remind, which only serves to spike everyone's anxiety. A successful contract focuses on the how rather than just the what. For a young adult with ADHD or anxiety, the contract should explicitly acknowledge that the task will feel frustrating and outline the exit strategy that isn't just quitting. For instance, instead of saying you must look for jobs for 2 hours, the contract might say you will engage in 20 minutes of job-seeking activity. If the alarm in your nervous system gets too loud, you will use a pre-agreed grounding technique for 5 minutes before deciding to continue or pause. This honors the neurobiological reality of their window of tolerance, while still requiring the muscle of the prefrontal cortex to remain engaged. This approach transforms the parent into a strategic coach and the young adult into an athlete in training. To implement a micro-friction contract effectively, the family must transition from a verbal understanding to a formal, documented agreement that serves as a neurological anchor for both parties. This contract is not a list of rules imposed by an authority, but a sovereignty agreement that defines the boundaries of responsibility. In the financial domain, requiring a consistent contribution, such as $50 a week toward groceries, is designed to dismantle the invisible resource myth. When a young adult must prioritize this payment over discretionary spending, they are engaging in response inhibition, forcing the brain to weigh immediate impulses against long-term obligations. Operationally, assigning a hard deadline for a task like cleaning the kitchen by 8 p.m. on Tuesdays creates a commitment device. For the parent, the contract mandates strategic silence, the agreement to not touch up a mediocre job or offer a friendly reminder at 7:45 p.m. This silence is the most difficult form of friction for the parent, as it requires them to sit with the anxiety of a potentially dirty kitchen or a missed payment without short-circuiting the consequence. When you fail to hold a young adult responsible for these agreements, you are engaging in a form of systemic sabotage that teaches several destructive lessons. First, you are teaching them that boundaries are negotiable based on emotional intensity. If a young adult learns that they can bypass friction by appearing stressed, angry, or overwhelmed, their brain reinforces helplessness as a survival strategy. Second, you are inadvertently confirming their own internal narrative of incompetence. Every time a parent covers a financial shortfall or finishes a half-done chore, the unspoken message sent to the young adult's subconscious is, I am doing this for you because I don't believe you are capable of doing it yourself. This erodes the very self-efficacy required to manage ADHD, anxiety, or depression. Instead of building a neurological callus, the parent is essentially keeping the child's psychological skin thin, making the inevitable friction of the outside world feel like a third-degree burn. Furthermore, failing to hold the line reinforces executive function atrophy. In the real world, the friction of a late fee, a fired employee, or a hungry household is indifferent to one's excuses. By removing these consequences at home, the parent creates a fictional reality. This prevents the neuroplasticity required for adulthood because the brain never receives the error signal necessary to change behavior. From a Bowen perspective, this lack of accountability keeps the family in a state of anxious fusion, where the parent's overfunctioning becomes the fuel for the child's underfunctioning. You aren't just letting them skip a chore. You are teaching them that they do not have to be an agent in their own life. This creates a learned dependency that often manifests later as deep-seated resentment or a total failure to launch, as the young adult eventually realizes they lack the basic tools to navigate a world that, unlike the home, will not bend its rules to accommodate their discomfort. From a generational perspective, this contract serves as a pattern breaker. If your family history is one of rescuing, the contract must include a clause for the parent. The parent's commitment to non-interference. This means the parent agrees not to offer reminders, not to check in on progress outside of a designated time, and not to fix the outcome if the young adult misses a deadline. This is often the hardest part of the friction plan. The parent must sit with the friction of watching their child fail a small task so that the child can avoid failing a large life stage. This mutual friction, the child struggling with the task and the parent struggling with the urge to help, is where the differentiation of self truly happens. It forces the system to stop its old dance and find a new, more stable equilibrium. Finally, the contract must be viewed as a living document that scales with the young adult's competence. As their frustration tolerance grows, evidenced by more staying power in their tasks, the friction should be increased, much like adding weight to a barbell. This might mean transitioning from a 10-minute laundry sprint to being responsible for the entire household's linens, or moving from a small utility contribution to a larger percentage of rent. This graduated approach ensures that the neuroplasticity is constantly being challenged without being overwhelmed. By the time the young adult is ready to launch, they aren't stepping into a world of unknown friction. They are simply applying the persistence muscles they have already perfected within the safety of the family training ground. Bowen theory emphasizes that behavior in families does not occur in isolation. Instead, family members influence one another through patterns that develop over time. When a young adult struggles with friction tolerance, the family system often adapts in ways that unintentionally reinforce the pattern. For example, a parent may repeatedly step in to solve problems because they want to reduce their child's stress. Another parent may become frustrated and attempt to enforce strict rules. The young adult may respond by withdrawing further. Over time, these roles become predictable within the system. Bowen referred to this dynamic as emotional interdependence, meaning the emotional responses of one family member influence the behavior of others. When families understand this dynamic, they can begin making small adjustments that gradually shift the system toward greater independence and resilience. Expand on this more and how it pertains to ADHD, OCD, anxiety, depression, etc., and generational patterns, why taking a look at the entire family is important. Expanding on Bowen family systems theory requires moving beyond the individual symptoms and looking at the emotional thermostat of the entire household. Bowen's core premise is that a family is an emotional unit. Therefore, a young adult's struggle with friction is rarely just about their personal grit. It is often a functional byproduct of the system's need for stability. When we introduce neurodivergence or mental health challenges like ADHD, OCD, or anxiety into this mix, the system's natural tendency to help can inadvertently become a lock and key mechanism that traps the individual in a state of perpetual adolescence. Taking a systemic view allows us to see that the identified patient, the young adult, is often expressing the unprocessed tension of the generations that came before them, the anxiety loop, ADHD, OCD, and overfunctioning. In Bowen theory, families deal with stress through a dance of overfunctioning and underfunctioning. When a young adult has ADHD or anxiety, they may struggle with executive friction for getting bills, losing jobs, or failing to plan. The family system, sensing the threat of the young adult's failure, triggers an automatic anxiety response in the parents. To lower their own anxiety, the parents step in to overfunction, paying the bill, waking them up for work, smoothing over social gaffes. The ADHD trap. The parent becomes the external prefrontal cortex. The more the parent plans, the less the young adult's brain needs to develop its own planning muscles. The system achieves a false equilibrium where the parent is exhausted and the child is incompetent. The OCD/anxiety trap. In cases of OCD or severe anxiety, the family often engages in accommodation. The system shifts its entire orbit to avoid triggering the young adult's distress. While done out of love, this removes the healthy friction necessary for exposure and response prevention. The world of the young adult shrinks because the family has built a wall around them to keep the friction out. Generational patterns and the multi-generational transmission process. Bowen's concept of the multi-generational transmission process suggests that the way we handle friction is inherited. If a grandfather was a rescuer who never let his children fail, and those children grew up feeling a subtle sense of inadequacy, they may overcompensate by being high-pressure parents. Alternatively, a family history of depression may have created a culture of fragility, where any sign of struggle is viewed as the beginning of a catastrophic collapse. The ultimate goal in Bowen theory is differentiation of self. This is the ability to be physically and emotionally connected to the family while remaining an autonomous individual who can think, feel, and act independently. Low differentiation. The family is enmeshed. If the young adult is depressed, the mother is depressed. If the young adult loses their job, the father feels like a failure. This lack of boundaries makes healthy friction feel like an attack on the family's collective soul. High differentiation. As parents, you can observe the young adults struggle with empathy, but without taking on the stress themselves. You can say, "It's hard that you lost your job, and I believe you have the skills to find a new one," without rushing in to fix it. This emotional neutrality is the highest form of support because it grants the young adult the dignity of their own experience. Why the entire family view is essential. Addressing ADHD, depression, or failure to launch by only sending the young adult to therapy is like trying to fix a single spark plug when the entire engine's timing is off. If the young adult gains 10% more friction tolerance in therapy, but returns to a home system that is 100% anxious and rescuing, the system will eventually force the young adult back into the under-functioner role to restore the family's familiar, albeit dysfunctional balance. True change happens when the most stable person in the system, usually the parent, decides to stop reacting to the anxiety. When the parent increases their own differentiation by stepping back and allowing healthy friction to exist, the entire system is forced to recalibrate. The young adult, no longer able to lean on the parent's overfunctioning, is finally forced to find their own center of gravity. The concept of healthy friction is rooted in the transition from dependency to interdependence. In many modern households, the desire to protect children from the harsh realities of life leads to an unintentional removal of all resistance. While this creates a peaceful home in the short term, it often results in failure to launch because the young adult has never had to develop the psychological calluses necessary to handle the friction of the real world. By reintroducing manageable challenges, such as financial contributions or non-negotiable chores, families are essentially building a laboratory for adulthood. This isn't about the dollar amount of the rent or the quality of the meal cooked. It is about the internalization of cause and effect. When a young adult experiences the direct link between their effort and their comfort, they move from being a passive consumer of the family's resources to an active stakeholder in its success. Deepening this practice requires a focus on executive function and cognitive load. For instance, requiring a teenager to manage a household responsibility like grocery shopping or meal planning forces them to engage in metacognition, thinking about thinking. They must project into the future, account for the needs of others, and troubleshoot when a required ingredient is missing. This develops the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and long-term planning. Without this friction, the brain remains in a reactive state, relying on others to solve problems. When we allow a young person to struggle through a logistical hurdle, we are gifting them the confidence that comes from competence. They learn that discomfort is not a signal to quit, but a signal that they are at the edge of their current capability and are about to grow. Furthermore, healthy friction serves as a vital antidote to the perfectionism paralysis that plagues many young adults today. By encouraging persistence in a job that is not ideal, parents help their children decouple their identity from their immediate circumstances. They learn that a bad day at work or a tedious task is not an existential crisis. but a manageable part of a larger journey toward independence. This builds distress tolerance, the ability to remain functional and regulated even when things are not going their way. In the absence of this friction, the first sign of professional or personal conflict can feel catastrophic. By holding the line on expectations at home, parents provide a low-stakes environment to practice high-stakes emotional regulation. Finally, the shift toward healthy friction requires a profound evolution in the parental identity. It is often harder for the parent to watch the struggle than it is for the child to experience it. The parental instinct is to smooth the path, but the consultant model of parenting recognizes that a smooth path leads to weak legs. True support in this phase of life is not about removing the obstacle. It is about standing by while the young adult navigates it, offering guidance only when the friction threatens to turn into crushing hardship. This creates a relationship based on mutual respect rather than subservience or resentment. As the young adult proves to themselves that they can handle the weight of responsibility, the friction eventually transforms into the traction they need to move forward into a life of their own making. These experiences gradually strengthen the brain's persistence pathways, and over time, friction stops feeling like a threat. Instead, it becomes the path toward competence. This episode is for educational purposes and to provide support. It is not a substitute for professional mental health evaluation, diagnosis, or treatment. The more we learn to recognize the patterns behind behavior, the more compassion and support we can offer to our kids, our partners, and ourselves. If this episode resonated with you and you would like additional support for your family, you can reach out directly by email at stephanieb@thepath-to-peacetherapy.com. If you are in California, I offer virtual sessions for families navigating ADHD, executive functioning challenges, anxiety, and complex family dynamics. You can also learn more about my work at thepath-to-peacetherapy.com. If this episode was helpful, please share it with a fellow parent, caregiver, or educator who may benefit from these insights. And as always, take a deep breath, give yourself some grace, and remember, peace is possible, and you don't have to do this alone.